Thank you, Steve. I'm going to talk a little bit this morning, and I'll keep my comments fairly short, and I think this will be better driven by what questions you want to ask me. But I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I had this really cute phrase I was going to use this morning, so I'll throw it out there, but it's not really right anymore. You know, it's data-centric consolidation leading to data center closure. But what it really is data-centric evaluation that leads to data center closure. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means. So within the Department of Navy, I want to set the stage of what we're trying to do. So we're on a process here to take $1.3 billion out of the IT budget that's related to data center spend. To help us do that, we've taken the money. It's a little bit like burning your ship. It's an effective management tool sometimes. We've decided to use it for this. One of the things I think that Steve led to that we have to focus on is you really do want to count the money. I mean, it's nice to count data centers. It's nice to count servers. But in the end, it is about counting fewer dollars. And how do we get there? And I think the way you have to get there is really understand the data. I am a data-driven guy. I like math, I like numbers, and I like data. The things that we're trying to look at as we do our data center closure, and I don't like the word consolidation. Consolidation leaves things in place. It does not get you the full amount of money. You got to close. You have got to close facilities. That's part of the cost. When I say savings, I want you to understand how we define savings too, because sometimes that's a complicated definition. I don't like complicated definitions. Savings to me means I spent less money. It's a very simple definition. It doesn't count cost avoidance. It means I spent less money. So we're going to try to spend $1.3 billion less. To make that happen, we've taken the $1.3 billion. To get there, you've got to understand the data that's in your data center. You really do. You have to understand the risk around that data, and it's not just a security risk. Very important to understand the security risk, but you've got to understand other risks around that data. How is the data packaged today? Is it in an application that lends itself to virtualization, that lends itself to maybe being modernized in a way that we can then eliminate the geographic considerations of where that data needs to be housed? I think there are a lot of people who believe, well, today all the technology out there doesn't matter where you house your data. You can put it in the middle of Iowa and it will be just fine. That's not true. You do have to factor where is your data. If it's an older application, in fact, sometimes you're not going to be able to move it that far away from the user base. Doesn't mean you can't save money on it, but you got to know those things. You've got to know what your data is used for. You got to know how many times you're using the same data element in how many databases, because one of the things that helps get the number of data centers down is getting rid of some of the data. That seems pretty obvious, but it's hard to do. You've got to go in and you've got to then understand at the data element level, what do you have in these data centers? How many times are you repeating the same data element? How many times are you saving it? How many applications do you need that data element in? You start pulling down the data, and that leads you to start questioning how many applications you need. So I think Steve is very right. You've got to combine. You'll hear people call data center rationalization, data center or application rationalization. I don't like that term either. I like application kill. You got to get rid of them. This is about getting rid of some of the applications. It's not about rationalization. You're going to do some of that, but if you want to save money, you got to get rid of applications. When you get rid of application, what are you getting rid of? Data. But that's what part of this is about. You have to understand your security risk. That means the risk of exposure of that data, what happens if you use it. You really do have to understand that. And in our business inside the Department of Navy, we really have to understand that, and you want us to understand that. You've got to be able to look at the cost drivers for your data centers. Now, I think everybody knows the biggest cost driver for data center is labor. It is still the biggest thing that costs. There are other factors into data centers that also relate to the data. The biggest factor around data is labor. How many people do you have managing the applications and the data? The structures of some of these applications that are older take more people to manage them. That's just a fact. You got to understand power. Power is a big player in data. So some of the things that we've tried to do in the Don. I have a dashboard that lists all of, and I say all of my data centers. I get a lot of questions, well, how many data centers do you have? Well, which definition do you want to use? What I would tell you is we have about 150 data centers that I'm going to operate on because they have enough, they're big enough that they spend enough money that I'm interested. I mean, part of what you have to do here is do a little bit of macro math. Where is your big money? And it's pretty much where are your big locations. Work on those first. That's what we're trying to do. Then you can go back and clean up, those places where you've got 12 servers, and it meets the definition of a data center. Okay, it meets the definition. But if it doesn't have a big dollar sign with it initially, I'm not too concerned. I'm not too worried about that. I really want to go after where I've got 50 servers or more. You also have to understand the facility that you're in. Department of Navy, fact, we own a lot of old buildings. One of the things that we have to take a look at is, and this gets into where cost avoidance does become somewhat important in this. If I have a data center today located in a building that A is currently costing me a lot of money to maintain, and when I look out and I work with facilities people and I see that, hey, this building, because of where it's at, to upgrade its coolant system, which is still a factor in data centers, to upgrade the building and keep it in standards, I have an out-year bill that's in the millions of dollars. That ought to play in my thinking that says maybe that's not where I want to stay. So you have to understand that. You've got to go through all your data, and one of the things we had done before we had, FedRAMP, we had the MAC levels. So we had gone through all our data and said, okay, what MAC level is that data at? That's a good starting point. Now we're doing that in the FedRAMP levels, what it is. What I can tell you, to get where I want to go, I've got to get over 50% of my data in some type of commercial solution. That's where we're headed. Now, what do I mean by some type of commercial solution? Think of an option. That can be anywhere where I am totally just going to a provided solution that's public. Some of you may know, Department of Navy, we are in the process of putting much of our public-facing data in an Amazon cloud solution. And people say, well, why are you doing an Amazon cloud solution? Because it saves me 66% of what I was spending. Why else am I doing that? Well, it's public-facing, so who's the audience? The public. Why isn't that in a place where the public can really get to it? I mean, there is some obvious things to do here, and we're trying to get to that. I could also have a solution that says it's a shared government environment. In the commercial world, but it's shared government. It's not an open cloud where everybody goes that. And then I can run to the extreme that says I have my own private solution. You'll notice I'm not using the word cloud. Part of those solutions can be cloud. Frankly, there is still a place for the standard data center non-cloud solution. There's still some of that makes sense to do. Getting that blend right and getting it into as much of the commercial environment I can is what I really have to do to, A, meet the mission, continue the security, and drive down the cost. So when I say I'm focused on cost, people say, well, that means you're not focused on mission. No, I think just like any business, if I don't make my product or make my mission, that's a pretty stupid thing to do. So a given is I got to meet mission, I got to meet product, I got to meet business requirements. How do I do that at the lowest cost? And one of the overlay factors for us that may be heavier than other people's is security. But it's still an overlay factor, and I have to understand the risk equation. That's a harder risk equation to get to. I'm not going to lie to you. How do you manage that risk equation that says this dollar of security buys me this much, the next dollar buys me how much more, and is it worth that risk? And of course, in our business, there are other factors besides the dollar inside of the security. What is the security risk? What's the risk of the data getting out from an exposure standpoint? What's the risk of the climate? And we're seeing that it get to be an industry. I mean, the Target incident, bad thing, but it's driving some good behavior. Now I see when people come in and talk to me in the industry, much more interest in all of those factors around security. Some of it, bottom line, but some of it is what happens to your reputation if that data gets out there. Target saw a significant drop initially in the number of shoppers. That affects bottom line, but there's a reputation piece there too. We have to look at all of that as we're looking at the data, and that helps you decide where you're going to put your data. We are fortunate inside the Don in that we've had experience with, I would call you, the commercial set of solutions. NMCI. You can hate NMCI. You can love NMCI. Here's the facts about what I will tell you about NMCI. NMCI levelized the IT playing field at cost inside the Department of the Navy. It did that. We paid overall less money. We got a better level of service for everybody. NGEN's taken us to the next level, and it is part of our data center answer. We already have big pieces of our data in a commercial data center. It is run today by HP, who won the NGEN contract, was won by NMCI. That's a commercial set of solutions. We can leverage some of that, and we're going to do that. We're going to go beyond that, and work on how do we get into some other large commercial players in that. How do we partner with other agencies? We are not, I think there's a big belief out here that we're not going to do anything with DISA. Just to set the record straight, we have a lot of stuff in DISA. We're going to continue to DISA. Great applause for DISA. If you haven't seen it, they've come out with the DISA Cloud data center solution. It is price competitive, very much so. When you look at the security they put in that and the pricing you can get, that's a very competitive solution for us. We're going to look at that. I think all of those factors are helping drive down both the government and the commercial cost. Steve and I were talking a little bit before this. I believe we got about a 5 to 6 year window right now where, because of what's happened in the commercial world, we have a glut of capacity. There's a lot of capacity in the commercial world that we have to, in the government, figure out how do we use that and take advantage of that lower cost because of the capacity glut. How long it will last, I think 5, 6 years easy. How do we capitalize on that? How do we get out there faster is the questions we're constantly asking ourselves. How do we take and make sure all of those factors get presented the same way? We talked about facilities, the power, the labor. How do you get the blended solution set that says this is the right optimization for this closure or for this set of data is what we struggle with, just like I think every industry that's of size is struggling today. The other thing I would tell you, a lot of this has to do more with the social changes than the technical. There are not a lot of technical issues that are not solvable here. Most of them have already been solved. But you have some social issues around data. People are used to having their data with them. They want that data right under their desk if they could have it. They'd have server farms right there. So you will have to get through some of that. Some of that's reasonable to think about. And in the past, we certainly have done some things where we made data and we said, okay, we can move it over here, and that did not deliver a good performance to the user. We've got to recognize that. So you also have the factor of being able to go in and show the user that your data plan, how you're going to structure their data, where you're going to put it, is going to deliver the service levels that they require. Now, that said, because I want to completely confuse you, we also have to get some standardization in the level of service required. So I will say this, as we went through our data, we found that most of our data is really level, in the old Mac levels 2 and 3, in the new levels it's a 3 to 5 level of data. That requires a certain level of storage and a certain level of access and a certain level of backup. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between Coop and data restoral. Coop, in our definition, is I've got kind of a hot backup that, if it goes down within 60 seconds, I can switch it over to another data center and I can have it up and running. That's really expensive. Guess what? Most data doesn't need that level of backup. But everybody wants that level of backup because it's really good to have. If you're the customer and you're the user of that data, hey, that's great to have the fact that if anything happens, I just switch over and I don't even see it. But there's a cost to that. So one of the things we are having to do is say inside the Don, sorry, this is what your data, this is what you get with your data. When we look at your requirement, we look at how you're using this data, we look at the mission value, you don't need a full Coop. You need some level of data restoration, and it will vary. Some cases it's 72 hours. Some cases I can live with the data getting back up in 5 or 6 days, and it's perfectly fine. That's okay. That lowers the cost. that lets me do things like if that's the case and I just need data restoration, and I'm not picking on Iowa this morning, it's just, it's all new story in Iowa this morning, but there's some great data centers in Iowa that really are cheap to operate. Now, one of the reasons they're cheap to operate is because they're not near anything. So it makes it a little hard, but for data restoration, if I'm just parking data and I just need to recover it in 5 days, I want to take advantage of those locations. How do I get it in there and say that's okay? We've got to do that. We have to think about not just what I'll call the primary data, where you're putting it to use every day, but how do you do your backup and how do you consolidate that in the lowest cost environment that you can, that again meets mission and security requirements, but actually meets requirements. I mean, I worked for a gentleman once that said, the minimum wouldn't be the minimum if it wasn't good enough. That's a fact. I mean, you in industry may be a little better at that because of the bottom line driving. You'll invest what you need to invest to meet your customer requirements. You'll have a certain level of satisfaction that you will agree to, and that's what you live to and that's what you invest to. We are very much in the data center business inside the Department of Navy doing the same thing. What is the requirement? What can the customer live with? What makes my investment balanced? And that's a hard thing to wrestle with, particularly inside an environment that's not used to operating that way. But that's where we're headed. That's what we're trying to get to. In addition to knowing all about our data structure and the applications, one of the things that we've made a decision on is in some cases it's okay to virtualize the data and park it somewhere else. I haven't made any change to that app. I've just virtualized it so it can move easier, wrapped it in a container. Now, some people say, well, that doesn't do anything to improve security. Every case we can, I want to try to improve security, but I'm back at cost. But I will argue this too. If I make something less expensive to operate and I haven't increased the security risk, and I'm already living with that security risk, is that okay? Yeah, the answer is yes. If that's still within a standard and still within a risk I'm willing to accept, and I have lessened the operational cost, that's okay. That's another argument that sometimes is hard to have with people that, well, wait a minute, but you still have this. Yeah, I still have the same risk. I can't fix that risk right now, but I can operate it at 25 to 30% less. That's a good thing. That actually frees up some money that maybe will let me fix the risk sooner. So these are a little bit different ways of thinking it, and you've got to package all of that in the right way to everybody in leadership understands it. Just like in business, you've got your corporate board. Well, we have a corporate board too, and it includes people inside the Department of Navy, inside the Department of Defense, and Congress. It's an interesting corporate board. How do you explain to them? They're asking some very good questions about data centers today and data in general. How do we answer that and make sure they understand what we're doing?